Titans of the West. And this is a new kind of idea that I kind of have. I want to go over some big individuals, some absolute titans of the past, titans of the West, guys who really moved forward the civilization that we know today. I think one of the biggest issues that we have is we've all heard the old adage or the saying that people say, hard times creates weak men create hard times, right? And then the hard times create strong men create what? Good times. And the good times make really weak men. So I think one of the main issues that in our society now, we don't recognize absolute strong figures of the past. I mean, I couldn't tell you besides some of the major political figures who I was taught in school of the past that I really respected. I didn't really know much about Mr. Rockefeller. I only know that he was horrible. He was evil. That's what I was taught. Mr. Ford. Oh, he was a tyrant. All these guys who were absolutely instrumental in creating the country and the West that we know. They were just frowned upon. And to me, we're gonna change that. We're gonna make it right. So without further ado, let's pay our ancestors some respect, and we're gonna go over Mr. Cecil John Rhodes. Now, if many of you don't know who he is, we actually kind of teleport back to a time near the Civil War, the American Civil War. But Mr. Rhodes is actually an English citizen, and he kind of has some lung issues when he's younger. He ends up deciding to forego his father's route, which his father is a preacher, an Anglican preacher. He was known for actually preaching to the 10-minute mark exactly. That's he would end. Not a second more, not a second less. He would specifically end at 10 minutes, which is funny. I always think of old preachers as going on forever. Not Mr. Rhodes. not Mr. Rhodes. But Cecil Rhodes, and I'll refer to him as Mr. Rhodes from now on. Mr. Rhodes decides not to go in his father's footsteps. He doesn't want to be a pastor, which is kind of like everybody's like, oh, like, come on, kid, you got to follow in your father's footsteps. So he decides to go into law. That's kind of what he wants to go after. So he begins to set up for that, but he starts having some big health issues, especially with his lungs. And through this, he ends up deciding to follow his brother down to South Africa to really pursue cotton. And the cotton industry had really grown down in South Africa. The main reason for this is the American Civil War begins to rage. And obviously, what happens? Cotton production plummets in the Deep South while the exports are still demanded. And the cotton ends up kind of coming from all over the planet, one place being South Africa. So Mr. Rhodes goes to South Africa to kind of pursue a little bit more of an entrepreneurial journey. As he kind of pursues the entrepreneurial journey, he makes a lot of connections and he learns a lot. So he gets into the business world, which is kind of something that I think was surprising to himself even. So in South Africa, Dutch is primarily spoken, and over time, Afrikaans, the language, is created, which is kind of a hybrid of Dutch, English, and local language, but primarily Dutch and English. It's kind of its own, what would I call, offshoot dialect. So South Africa begins to change. It goes from a Dutch to more of a French ruled, and then the English decide, hey, we don't want the French having control over the southern ports of Africa. We want to be the big dogs as they kind of continue to grow. The English Empire then expands, and it takes South Africa. Mr. Rhodes begins to he continues, I should say, his entrepreneurial journey. And he goes ahead and he starts setting up different cotton production. He ends up leaving. Let me check that. So during his time in the cotton industry, he really differentiates the incentive program between the English or the European workers and the African workers. And that's one thing that's very, very interesting about Mr. Rhodes is he was one of these guys that wasn't really seen as a massive visionary, to where he definitely casted a vision in the future, which one of his main sayings was Cape Town to Cairo, or Cairo to Cape. And that was the concept of English rule, right? From Cairo to Cape Town, the whole of Africa. But what was interesting is he didn't really have a systematic plan ahead of him. He didn't say, this is how we're going to do X, Y, and Z. He was more of an adaptative kind of person. He definitely figured it out as he went, and he was very, very effective at it because he was just very good at adapting. So over time, he ends up creating different incentive programs for, in especially the cotton industry and all through his diamond mining and his gold mining explorations, to where he realized, like, hey, the Europeans are not incentivized by the same thing as the Africans, and vice versa. So while most people saw the Africans in that time as kind of children, and they just didn't understand what incentivized them. So Mr. Rhodes kind of took a different approach, and it really helped him move the needle forward. So as he kind of continues, the cotton industry dries up. It just isn't as successful as he really had hoped. But the diamond rush happens. South Africa, a huge diamond rush. They find diamonds. They find different soil that's a lot easier to dig through. And, it's a massive diamond mine. It's really interesting how he kind of gets into the industry. But to make it short, he decides to enter the industry, and he makes a business partner, and he mines. In this time, he ends up making a lot of connections with a lot of future parliamentary members and a lot of really high-end doctors, a lot of powerful guys. Makes a lot of friends in his new venture into the minerals, the mineral industry. So through this mineral quest, if you want to call it, he ends up making a business partner. His business partner kind of takes care of it, and in the meantime, Mr. Rhodes gets word that his mother is dying, so he goes back home to England while his friend, his business partner, runs the operations in South Africa. And he goes back to England, where he attends Oxford. He decides to finish up his degree. He then makes a lot more friends in the English, I would say, community, especially amongst the high-ranking people. He also then joins the Freemasons. Uh-oh. But it's not as bad as it sounds. He actually ends up disliking them. He says that they don't have an end goal. He was more about, hey, there needs to be an end destination. Give me an end destination. And he actually then wanted to start his own secret society. So he was kind of a, what do we call that? I don't know what it's exactly called, but he's an interesting guy in that side of things. But he ends up coming back to South Africa, and he begins to look for a way to expand the English Empire. And the way that things kind of evolve, especially in the British Empire at this point, is the British really give their citizens a lot of leeway. So if you say, hey, I'm going to go here and I'm going to start a business, or I'm going to take these minerals here and I'm going to kind of annex the area, when I subdue it to a certain extent, then it can become part of the British Empire. So this is Mr. Rhodes' kind of selling point. So he ends up, he kind of has that idea. He starts setting things up, and he gets into the diamond industry. He also he continues in the diamond industry, and he gets into the gold industry. The gold rush continues, or starts and then continues. But Mr. Rhodes ends up using a lot of leverage to acquire all of the, or at least most of the market in South Africa for diamond mines. And the main goal with this is to then shrink supply and jack up the prices. Worked very, very well for him. He ends up really becoming a dominant mogul in the diamond space and in the industries of minerals there, including gold and other precious metals. And as he continues to become more and more powerful, he then sets his sights north. And as he sets his sights north, he encounters what is known as, I forget the name of the king, but it's an African king there in Zimbabwe. And this African king is he's in charge of a lot of mines of their own. So Mr. Rhodes strikes a deal, and he says, hey, I tell you what, I will get exclusive mining rights to your area, but I'm going to give you X, Y, and Z. So Mr. Rhodes ends up building extreme amounts of infrastructure into Zimbabwe, from trains to roads and all these different things that are going to really allow it to become a functioning economy. So it was very interesting how it kind of transpired, but either way, the king and Mr. Rhodes have kind of a falling out. Now, here's where Mr. Rhodes was very smart in kind of playing 4D chess. He had already set up an agreement with the country, or the Zulu king, or I shouldn't say Zulu king. Okay, hold on, let's restart. He had already struck an agreement with the king there in Africa, of the Zimbabwe area. And this was seen to the English as, well, he has the only rights to minerals there. So that kind of gave Rhodes a little bit more leeway as far as what he would do. And when the African king kind of broke contract, well, guess what? Mr. Rhodes buys a lot of ammunition, he buys a lot of weapons, he buys a lot of soldiers, and he goes to war. So Mr. Rhodes goes to war with an African king. Mr. Rhodes dominates and conquers the king there, and then establishes what we know as Rhodesia. Yes, after his name. So Mr. Rhodes establishes Rhodesia, and he continues throughout. The English continue to try to subdue like the Boers through the Boer Wars, and things really get heated between the Europeans. But Mr. Rhodes somehow kind of skirts through all this. He seems to have enough connections throughout, and he wants to see the English Empire continue to expand. So the actual Rhodesia continues to last even past his time. It's his legacy. And it continues many, many years after he actually dies. So he actually has a quote here. He says, "Africa is lying ready for us, and it is our duty to take it. It is our duty to seize the opportunity by acquiring more territory for Anglo-Saxons." So he saw this as his kind of life's mission, if you will, his Cairo to Cape Town. And one thing that I found really interesting is, he had a massive vision. He didn't really have a systematic way of getting there, but he ends up making his own country as kind of part of that. And I just found Mr. Rhodes. My initial kind of recognition of him is, why is this country called Rhodesia when I know that there's a man named Cecil Rhodes? I just didn't understand really the inner workings of that. Like, how does a country be named after a guy, right? After a businessman. He conquers an African king, starts his own country. It's insane. So anyway, Rhodesia lasts until 1980. 1980. And then it switches to Zimbabwe, and you have a lot of falling out. But either way, Mr. Rhodes, he gets the highlight of the week. He really lived an absolutely amazing life, really of entrepreneurship, but a lot of leverage in the global space. And back then, I mean, if you were a mogul in the global space, I mean, that's really impressive, right? You think today you can now get on a plane and you can get to Dubai within a day. Not back then, right? So I found it really interesting. He went from a preacher's son to an Oxford guy. He really made a lot of connections through his diamond mining, but he ends up dying at the young age of 48 years old. Doesn't live very long, and his legacy continues on as Rhodesia. That's all I gotta say.